was a powerful Egyptian ruler, just a famous beauty who charmed powerful men. Did a French queen really tell her starving subjects to eat cake? Did a grieving English monarch spend the last 40 years of her life in a permanent state of joyless mourning? History is filled with stories we think we know. We see them in movies and read them in books, and they become part of our shared understanding of the past. But so often, the most famous stories about powerful women are the least true. They are tales shaped by enemies, by political propaganda, or by later generations who wanted a simpler, more dramatic story. The truth is almost always more complicated, more human, and far more interesting. Number 19. Did Marie Antoinette really say let them eat cake? The phrase was first written down by the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He wrote it in his book Confessions when Marie Antoinette was just 9 years old and still living in her home country of Austria. The person who supposedly said the line was described only as a great princess. By the time the story was attributed to Marie Antoinette, she had been dead for decades. The story is one of the most famous in history. The people of Paris are starving. There is no bread. They riot in the streets. Someone tells the young, beautiful Queen Marie Antoinette about their suffering. Floating in a bubble of royal privilege at the Palace of Versailles, she supposedly replies with a dismissive, cruel line, kills Mangent de la Brioche. Let them eat cake. The phrase seems to capture everything about the disconnect between the monarchy and the common person. It paints the queen as heartless, clueless, and utterly undeserving of her position. It became a powerful piece of propaganda that fueled the French Revolution and justified her eventual journey to the guillotine. But she never said it. There is not a single credible piece of evidence from her lifetime that links her to that phrase. The story is a complete fabrication, a piece of political slander that has stuck for over 2 centuries. To understand why it was so effective, we have to look at the world she lived in and the forces working against her. The phrase itself wasn't even new. Variations of the story about a clueless royal suggesting an absurd alternative to bread had been circulating in France for a century. It was a kind of political folktale told about different out-of-touch aristocrats. Rousseau's mention of it in his book, which was written between 1765 and 1767, is the most famous early example. At that time, Marie Antoinette was a young archduchess in Vienna with no connection to France at all. So how did it get pinned on her? Politics. Marie Antoinette was a perfect target for revolutionary propagandists. First, she was a foreigner. From the moment she arrived in France at age 14 to marry the future Louis XVI, she was known as Autrichienne, the Austrian woman. This was not a term of endearment. It was a constant reminder that she was an outsider, representing a traditional enemy of France. You know, anything that went wrong could be blamed on foreign influence, and she was the living symbol of it. Second, she was a woman. In a society where women had little official power, a queen was always viewed with suspicion. Her influence over the king was seen as unnatural and dangerous. Pamphlets called libelles were a major form of media in 18th century France. They were often filled with scandalous and completely untrue stories about public figures. Marie Antoinette was a favorite subject. These pamphlets accused her of everything from lavish spending to treason. They created a caricature of a wicked, selfish queen long before the revolution reached its peak. The "let them eat cake" line fit perfectly into this pre-existing narrative. It confirmed everyone's worst suspicions about her. The truth of her character was much different. Her personal letters show a woman who was often deeply concerned with the welfare of others. There are numerous documented accounts of her giving money from her own allowance to help families in need. She was a devoted mother, and by all accounts, a relatively shy person who disliked the rigid formality of court life. She built a small model village on the grounds of Versailles, the Hameau de la Reine, where she and her children could pretend to be peasants. This was later used as evidence of her being out of touch, but it also showed a desire for a simpler, more normal existence. The real cause of the bread shortages was not the queen's indifference, but a series of complex economic problems. bad, harvests, deregulation of the grain market, and a national treasury bankrupted by foreign wars created the perfect storm for famine and unrest. It was easier for revolutionary leaders to blame a single person, a foreign queen, than to explain complex economic policy to a hungry mob. The quote first appeared in print connected to her name in 1843, 50 years after her death. By then, the legend had completely replaced the reality. The story of the Callous Queen and her famous line was too good, too simple, and too useful to be corrected by the messy truth. It was a lie that helped topple a monarchy. Number 18 was Cleopatra, a great beauty who seduced her way to power. And Cleopatra VII spoke at least 9 languages, including Egyptian, Greek, and Latin. She was the first ruler of her dynasty in 300 years to bother learning the language of the Egyptian people she governed. She was also a skilled mathematician, chemist, and philosopher, having studied at the Museum in Alexandria, which housed the Great Library of Alexandria. The coins minted during her reign show a woman with a prominent nose and a strong jaw, not the delicate features of a modern movie star. The popular image of Cleopatra is of a stunningly beautiful woman. She is portrayed as an exotic seductress who used her looks to enchant 2 of the most powerful men in the world, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, to protect her throne. This version of her story, popularized by Shakespeare and cemented by Hollywood films, focuses almost entirely on her romances and her appearance. It reduces one of the most brilliant political minds of the ancient world to a simple femme fatale. The truth is that her power came not from her beauty, but from her intellect. The idea of Cleopatra as a great beauty comes almost entirely from her enemies. After she and Mark Antony were defeated by Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, Rome launched a massive propaganda campaign against her. And Octavian needed to justify a difficult civil war against Antony, a fellow Roman. It was much easier to paint Antony as a noble Roman who had been bewitched and corrupted by a wicked foreign sorceress. Roman historians like Cassius Dio and Plutarch wrote their accounts decades or even centuries after her death, drawing on this Augustan propaganda. They portrayed her as decadent, manipulative, and obsessed with luxury. Her supposed beauty was a key part of this character assassination. It was the tool she used to weaken great Roman men. Contemporary evidence tells a different story. The coins she issued show a portrait that is far from the Hollywood ideal. While portraits on coins were often stylized to project power rather than capture a perfect likeness, they certainly don't suggest that her primary attribute was physical beauty. Plutarch, one of the main sources for the seductress myth, actually says that her looks were not altogether incomparable and that it was her conversation, her charm, and the tone of her voice that were her most captivating qualities. He describes a woman of immense intelligence and charisma. Cleopatra was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek family that had ruled Egypt since the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC. She was not ethnically Egyptian. She was a formidable ruler long before she met any Romans. She came to the throne as a teenager and quickly proved to be a ruthless and effective politician, navigating a court full of intrigue and betrayal. Her kingdom, Egypt, was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. It was incredibly wealthy but also vulnerable, caught between the expanding power of Rome and other regional conflicts. And Cleopatra's primary goal was to maintain Egypt's independence. Her relationships with Caesar and Antony were not romantic flings. They were strategic political alliances. When she met Julius Caesar, she was in the middle of a civil war with her younger brother. She needed a powerful ally to secure her throne. By aligning herself with Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome, she got one. Their relationship produced a son, Caesarion, which further solidified her political position. After Caesar's assassination, she formed a new alliance with Mark Antony. This was an even more powerful partnership. Together, they controlled the entire eastern half of the Roman world. It was a political and military union that posed a direct threat to Octavian's ambitions in the West. This, more than any romance, is why Octavian declared war. He declared war on Cleopatra, not Antony, cleverly framing it as a foreign conflict, not another Roman civil war. The myth of the beautiful seductress was the perfect tool to sell that war to the Roman people. It has been so successful that it has defined her image for 2,000 years, obscuring the reality of a brilliant leader who played the game of power at the highest level and almost won. Number 17 was Bloody Mary, the cruelest Tudor monarch. During the 5-year reign of Mary, around 283 religious dissenters were burned at the stake. In contrast, during the 38-year reign of her father, Henry VE, the number of executions for all crimes, including treason and heresy, is estimated to be as high as 72,000, though modern historians believe the number is lower. It was still in the many thousands. Her younger sister, Elizabeth I, also executed hundreds for their faith, though often under the legal guise of treason rather than heresy. No monarch in English history is so defined by a single brutal nickname as Mary I, Bloody Mary. The name conjures up images of a bitter, vengeful queen who delighted in burning Protestants. She is remembered as a religious fanatic whose reign was an anomaly of cruelty in the story of England. This reputation was crafted almost entirely by her enemies, particularly by one man, John Fox. His Book of Martyrs, published during the reign of her successor, Elizabeth I, was a masterful work of Protestant propaganda. It detailed, in gruesome detail, the stories of the men and women burned during Mary's reign. The book was a massive bestseller and was placed in churches across England. For centuries, it was one of the most widely read books in the country after the Bible. It single-handedly created the image of Bloody Mary that endures to this day. But was she uniquely cruel? Or was she simply a ruler of her time? The 16th century was a brutal age. Public execution was a common tool of state power across Europe. The idea of religious tolerance did not exist. Rulers believed it was their sacred duty to protect their country from heresy, which was seen as a disease that could destroy society. When Mary came to the throne in 1553, she inherited a kingdom that had been torn apart by religious conflict for decades. Her father, Henry VE, had broken with the Catholic Church to secure a divorce, declaring himself the head of the Church of England. Under her younger brother, Edward VI, England had been pushed in a much more radical Protestant direction. Mary was a devout Catholic. She saw it as her life's mission to return England to the true faith and heal the schism with Rome. In her mind, she was not being cruel, she was being a good queen, saving the souls of her subjects from eternal damnation. The punishment for heresy across Europe for both Catholics and Protestants was burning at the stake. This was seen as a way to purify the soul of the heretic and serve as a terrifying warning to others. Mary's government was using a standard, if horrific, method of enforcing religious conformity. Her actions were not without precedent in her own family. Her father, Henry VE, had executed both Protestants and Catholics who refused to accept his religious authority. He boiled people alive for poisoning and oversaw a brutal suppression of the Pilgrimage of Grace, a Catholic uprising in the north. Her sister, Elizabeth I, is remembered as Good Queen Bess, a symbol of the English Golden Age, but her reign was also built on religious persecution. She executed nearly 200 Catholics, many of whom were hanged, drawn, and quartered, a far more prolonged and agonizing death than burning. But because Elizabeth's reign was long and ultimately successful, and because history is written by the victors, her victims were framed as traitors to the state, while Mary's were framed as innocent martyrs for their faith. Mary's reign was also short and marked by personal and political failures that made her an easy target for later historians. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain was deeply unpopular. It produced no heir, leaving her heartbroken and politically vulnerable. England also lost Calais, its last territory in France, under her rule. She died after only 5 years on the throne, allowing her Protestant sister Elizabeth to take over and reverse all of her religious policies. The Protestant narrative became the national narrative. John Foxe's book gave people a simple story. The dark, bloody, Catholic reign of Mary was followed by the glorious, enlightened Protestant reign of Elizabeth. It was a powerful myth that served the new regime perfectly. Mary was not a gentle ruler, but she was a product of her violent, intolerant age, no more or less bloody than the father and sister who came before and after her. Number 16. Did Anne Boleyn have a sixth finger and other deformities? The first and most influential description of Anne Boleyn having a sixth finger comes from a Catholic propagandist named Nicholas Sander. He wrote his account in 1585, nearly 50 years after Anne was executed. Sander, who was a baby when Anne died, never met her. His goal was to discredit Anne and her daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, and portray the English Reformation as the product of a monstrous, immoral woman. No contemporary account from Anne's lifetime ever mentions her having a sixth finger. The story of Anne Boleyn's extra finger is a persistent and vivid detail in the popular imagination. And it's often paired with other supposed deformities, like a projecting tooth or a large mole on her neck, which she supposedly covered with high-collared dresses and statement necklaces. These physical flaws are used to paint her as a witch, a seductress who used dark arts to bewitch King Henry V and lure him away from his rightful wife, Catherine of Aragon. This narrative conveniently explains how she could have driven the king to break with the Catholic Church and upend the entire social and religious order of England. She wasn't just a clever woman, she was a monster. This entire story is a lie, crafted for political purposes long after she was gone. Nicholas Sander was the primary architect of this myth. He wrote his book, Rise and Growth of the Anglican Schism, while in exile. It was a piece of propaganda designed to rally support for a Catholic restoration in England. He needed to delegitimize the entire Tudor succession that came from Anne. By portraying Anne as physically deformed, he was tapping into the 16th century belief that outer ugliness reflected inner evil and corruption. A sixth finger, in particular, was often considered a sign of witchcraft. If Anne was a witch, then her marriage to Henry was invalid, and their daughter, Elizabeth, was not a legitimate queen. The historical evidence completely contradicts Sander's claims. Not a single person who actually knew Anne, not even her sworn enemies, ever mentioned these deformities. The Spanish ambassador Eustace Chapuz despised Anne and wrote countless letters back to Spain detailing her every move and flaw. He called her the concubine and a she-devil. He would have leaped at the chance to report any physical imperfection that could be used to undermine her. Yet, in all his extensive correspondence, there is no mention of a sixth finger, a strange tooth, or anything of the sort. In fact, contemporary accounts that do mention her appearance often praise it. The Venetian ambassador described her as not one of the handsomest women in the world, but noted her most attractive eyes. Others commented on her elegance, her sharp wit, her fashionable French style, and her slender hands. The idea that a woman with a visible deformity like a sixth finger could have captivated the notoriously vain and superstitious Henry V is also highly unlikely. Henry was obsessed with perfection in himself and in his heirs. He saw his lack of a male heir with Catherine of Aragon as a sign of God's displeasure. He would have viewed any physical abnormality in a potential queen as a very bad omen. Furthermore, court life was public and scrutinized. As a lady in waiting and later as queen, Anne was constantly on display. A sixth finger would have been impossible to hide and would have been the subject of widespread gossip and commentary. The silence from contemporary sources is deafening and speaks volumes. The myth of her deformities has survived because it provides a simple, almost supernatural explanation for a complex historical event. It's easier to imagine a king being ensnared by a six-fingered witch than to grapple with the tangled realities of dynastic politics, royal ego, and theological revolution. The story turns Anne Boleyn into a one-dimensional villain, obscuring the intelligent, ambitious, and deeply religious woman she actually was. She played a dangerous game and lost, but she was a human being, not a monster from a fairy tale. Number 15 was Queen Victoria, an unsmiling widow who hated being queen. In her private diaries, which spanned 122 volumes, Queen Victoria wrote extensively about her deep love for her husband, Prince Albert, often in passionate and joyful terms. She also wrote about her love of dancing, music, and painting. The popular image of her as a perpetually stern and gloomy figure is based almost entirely on the last 40 years of her life, after Albert's death in 1861. For the first half of her reign, she was known for her energy and her capacity for enjoyment. The image is iconic: Queen Victoria dressed in black, her face set in a permanent frown, the very embodiment of dour, repressed Victorian morality. We remember her as the Widow of Windsor, a monarch who retreated from public life after the death of her beloved husband and spent the next 4 decades in mourning. This image has come to define not just her, but the entire era named after her. It suggests a time of rigid formality, emotional suppression, and joylessness. While she certainly mourned Albert deeply, and for the rest of her life, this picture is a caricature that ignores the vibrant young woman she once was and the powerful monarch she remained. Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837. As an 18-year-old girl, she was small, energetic, and determined to escape the suffocating control of her mother and her advisor, Sir John Conroy. Her early years as queen were marked by a love of parties, balls, and the opera. Her diaries from this period are full of excitement and enthusiasm for her new role. She fell deeply and passionately in love with her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Their marriage in 1840 was a genuine love match, a partnership of deep affection and mutual respect. They had 9 children together, and by all accounts, their family life, while formal by modern standards, was a source of great happiness for her. Albert's death from typhoid fever in 1861, at the age of 42, was an unimaginable blow. Victoria was utterly devastated. She wrote, "The poor fatherless baby of 8 months is now the utterly broken-hearted and crushed widow of 42. She plunged into a state of deep mourning, withdrawing almost completely from public life for several years. She wore black for the rest of her life and commissioned countless memorials to Albert. This period of seclusion is the source of the dour widow myth. Her subjects grew impatient with their absent monarch, and Republican sentiment began to rise. However, to say she spent the next 40 years doing nothing but mourning is completely wrong. While she never stopped grieving for Albert, she eventually returned to her duties as queen with renewed vigor. She was not a passive figurehead. She was a deeply engaged and often stubborn constitutional monarch who wielded considerable influence. She corresponded daily with her prime ministers, offering her opinions on everything from colonial policy in India to army reforms. She had famously strong relationships with some prime ministers like Benjamin Disraeli, and famously difficult ones with others like William Gladstone. She was the Empress of India, the head of a global empire on which the sun never set. This was not the work of a woman lost in grief. The reason for the unsmiling image is also partly technological. Photography was a new and cumbersome process in the Victorian era. Exposure times were long, requiring subjects to hold a pose for several minutes. A neutral, serious expression was much easier to maintain than a smile. The formal portraits of Victoria were meant to project an image of imperial majesty and seriousness, not warmth and joy. In her private life, she was known to have a hearty laugh and a strong sense of humor. She delighted in her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, who numbered in the dozens and married into royal families across Europe, earning her the nickname the Grandmother of Europe. Her reign, which lasted nearly 64 years, was a period of immense change, industrial revolution, scientific discovery, and massive expansion of the British Empire. She was a symbol of stability and continuity in a rapidly changing world. The myth of the sad, unsmiling widow reduces a long and complex reign to a single personal tragedy. It overlooks the resilience, the sense of duty, and the political shrewdness of a woman who defined an age. Number 14, did Eleanor of Aquitaine poison her husband's mistress? The story of Eleanor of Aquitaine confronting her rival, Rosamund Clifford, with a dagger and a bowl of poison is a legend that first appeared in the French Chronicle of London, written more than 50 years after Rosamund's death. There is no contemporary evidence to support this dramatic tale. Rosamund Clifford likely died of natural causes at a convent in Godstow around 1176. Eleanor of Aquitaine was actually imprisoned by her husband, King Henry II, at the time of Rosamund's death, and would not have had the opportunity to carry out such an act. It's a story worthy of an opera. King Henry II of England keeps his beautiful mistress, fair Rosamund Clifford, hidden away in a secret labyrinth at his palace in Woodstock. His jealous and formidable wife, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, discovers the maze, follows a silken thread to its center, and confronts her rival. She presents Rosamund with a choice die by the dagger or by the poison. The beautiful mistress chooses the poison and dies. This tale of passion, jealousy, and revenge has been a favorite of poets and balladeers for centuries. It cements Eleanor's reputation as a fiery, ruthless woman who would stop at nothing to get her way. But like so many dramatic historical tales, it's pure fiction. The legend of Fair Rosamund's poisoning emerged decades after the real events and grew more elaborate with each retelling. It taps into a classic dramatic trope, the scorned, powerful wife versus the young, innocent mistress. In reality, the situation was far more complex and far less theatrical. Rosamund Clifford was indeed the mistress of Henry II. Their relationship was well known and became public around 1174. This was a deep humiliation for Eleanor, not just personally, but politically. It was a public declaration of her declining influence with the king. However, Eleanor's reaction was not to seek out her rival with a bowl of poison. Her response was political. In 1173, a year before the affair became public knowledge, Eleanor supported her sons in a major rebellion against their father, Henry II. The Great Revolt of 1173 to 1174 was a serious challenge to Henry's authority, involving his sons, Henry the Young King, Richard the Future, Lionheart, and Geoffrey. Eleanor's motivations were complex. She was angry about Henry's infidelities, but more importantly, she was frustrated by his refusal to delegate any real power to her or their sons in the vast territories they were supposed to rule. The rebellion failed. Henry II defeated his sons and captured his wife. He then imprisoned Eleanor, keeping her under house arrest for the next 16 years. It was during this period of Eleanor's imprisonment that Rosamund Clifford died around the year 1176. She was at Godstow Nunnery near Oxford, and all credible evidence suggests she died of an illness. Henry had openly acknowledged her as his mistress and provided for her, and he mourned her death. The idea that the imprisoned Eleanor could have somehow escaped, navigated a mythical labyrinth, and forced Rosamund to drink poison is a logistical and historical impossibility. So why did the story catch on? It provided a more personal, romantic explanation for the epic political feud between Henry and Eleanor. A tale of a jealous wife's revenge is far more compelling for many than a story about disputes over the administration of Aquitaine and Anjou. The legend also served to blacken Eleanor's name. She was an incredibly powerful woman in her own right, the ruler of the vast and wealthy duchy of Aquitaine. Throughout her life, she defied the conventions of what a medieval woman, even a queen, was supposed to be. She went on crusade, she divorced one king, Louis VII of France, married another, Henry II of England, and was the mother of two English kings, Richard I and John. Such a powerful and unconventional woman was bound to attract scandalous rumors. The myth of the poisoner was a way to cut her down to size, reducing her political ambitions to simple feminine jealousy. The real Eleanor was a brilliant and ruthless political operator, a true medieval power player whose actions were driven by a desire for power and a fierce protection of her son's inheritance, not by a simple crime of passion. Number 13 was Elizabeth I, just the virgin queen who refused to marry. Elizabeth I used her unmarried status as a powerful diplomatic tool for over 2 decades. By entertaining marriage proposals from various European princes, she could play rival powers like France and Spain against each other without ever committing to a binding alliance. For example, she engaged in prolonged negotiations with 2 different French princes, the Duke of Anjou and the Duke of Alencon, which helped to keep France from allying with Spain against England. Her refusal to marry was a strategic choice, not a personal failure. Queen Elizabeth I is known to history as the Virgin Queen. Her unmarried, childless state is often presented as the central, defining fact of her life and reign. The narrative is often a romantic one. She sacrificed her personal happiness for the good of her country, or perhaps she was heartbroken by a childhood love, Robert Dudley, and could never love another. Sometimes it's portrayed as a personal failing, an inability to choose a husband. Whatever the reason, the focus on her virginity and her single status often overshadows her actual achievements as a ruler. It reduces her 45-year reign, a period of immense cultural and political significance, to a question of her marital status. The truth is that Elizabeth's decision to remain unmarried was one of the most brilliant and successful political strategies of her reign. It was a masterclass in diplomacy and power retention. When she came to the throne in 1558, England was a relatively weak, religiously divided country facing the formidable powers of Catholic France and Spain. A royal marriage in the 16th century was never just a personal matter, it was the ultimate political alliance. If Elizabeth married a foreign prince like Philip II of Spain, who did propose, she risked turning England into a satellite of another power. Her own sister Mary's unpopular marriage to Philip had demonstrated this danger clearly. If she married an English nobleman like Robert Dudley, she would undoubtedly provoke massive jealousy and factionalism among the other powerful families at court. By refusing to either marry or definitively reject her many suitors, Elizabeth created what became known as the marriage game. For years, she kept a whole host of European dukes and princes dangling, using the prospect of her hand in marriage as a diplomatic weapon. She could hint at an alliance with France to make Spain nervous, then entertain a Spanish or Austrian proposal to keep the French in check. This constant negotiation kept her enemies off balance and prevented them from forming a united Catholic front against Protestant England. It was a way of buying time, allowing England to grow stronger and more stable without being drawn into costly European wars. This strategy was also crucial for maintaining her own power at home. As a female monarch in a man's world, any husband would have expected to be the real ruler. He would have become king, and Elizabeth's own authority would have been diminished. She had seen how her sister Mary had been sidelined by her husband Philip. Elizabeth had no intention of suffering the same fate. She once told Parliament, "I will have but one mistress here and no master." By remaining single, she ensured that she was the sole focus of power in her kingdom. All patronage, titles, and influence flowed directly from her. She famously said she was married to her kingdom, and in a political sense, this was true. The Virgin Queen persona was also a powerful piece of public relations. In a country that was breaking away from the Catholic Church, the cult of the Virgin Mary was being dismantled. The cult of the Virgin Queen, a pure, almost divine figure dedicated solely to her people, rose to take its place. It created an image of a monarch who had sacrificed personal fulfillment for the well-being of the nation. This inspired immense loyalty and devotion among her subjects. While the question of her personal relationships, particularly with Robert Dudley, will always be a subject of speculation, it's clear that her public status as the Virgin Queen was a calculated political identity. It was the key to her independence, her diplomatic success, and her control over her own kingdom for over 4 decades. It wasn't a failure to find a husband. It was a resounding success in keeping her crown. Number 12. Did Isabella of Castile sell her jewels to fund Columbus? The story that Queen Isabella sold her personal jewels to pay for Christopher Columbus's voyage is a myth. The royal treasury of Castile did help to fund the expedition, but the money came from several sources. A significant portion of the funds was put up by Luis de Santangel, the finance minister of the Kingdom of Aragon, who advanced the money as a loan to the crown. The Pinzon brothers, wealthy ship owners from the town of Palos, also contributed and provided the 2 smaller ships, the Nina and the Pinta. The story of the jewels was a later invention meant to portray Isabella as uniquely pious and visionary. It's one of the most enduring and romantic images from the age of discovery Christopher Columbus. His dreams of a westward voyage to the Indies, rejected by court after court, finally finds a patron. Queen Isabella of Castile, a ruler of deep faith and foresight, is so moved by his cause that when the royal treasury is empty, she declares she will sell her own personal jewels to make his expedition possible. It's a tale of personal sacrifice in the name of faith and exploration. It paints Isabella as the godmother of the New World, whose personal investment made it all happen. This story is a complete fabrication. While Queen Isabella was indeed a crucial supporter of Columbus, her crown jewels were never on the line. The financing of Columbus's 1492 voyage was a much more practical and less dramatic affair. The Spanish monarchy had just completed the Reconquista, a centuries-long effort to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Moorish rule, culminating in the conquest of Granada in 1492. The war had been incredibly expensive, and the treasury was indeed strained. However, the crown was not broke. The funding for Columbus's 3 ships was cobbled together from several sources. The total cost was around 2 million maravedis, which was not a huge sum for a royal enterprise at the time. Queen Isabella's government agreed to put up about 1.14 million maravedis. This money did not come from a jewelry box. It came from the crown treasury of Castile, likely from funds recently acquired from the Granada campaign. A large part of this sum was advanced as a loan by Luis de Santangel, the keeper of the privy purse for Isabella's husband, King Ferdinand of Aragon. He was a shrewd financier who saw the potential for a return on the investment. He was not just a loyal courtier, he was a businessman making a calculated risk. The remaining funds came from other sources. Columbus himself was supposed to contribute, and he likely got backing from Italian bankers based in Seville. A large portion of the cost was also borne by the port town of Palos de la Frontera. As punishment for some past offense, the town was ordered by the crown to provide 2 fully crewed caravels for the expedition for a period of 2 months at no cost. This is how the Nina and the Pinta joined the voyage. Their owners, the Pinzon brothers, were experienced mariners who became key captains in the expedition and invested their own money as well. So where did the jewel story come from? It appears to have been popularized centuries later, most notably by the American writer Washington Irving in his 1828 biography of Columbus. Irving was a master of romantic storytelling, and his book was more historical fiction than strict fact. The tale of the Queen's Jewels added a touch of personal drama and piety to the story that appealed to 19th century sensibilities. It transformed a complex state-sponsored enterprise, financed by loans and royal decrees, into a simple act of a noble queen's faith. Isabella was a powerful and ruthless ruler. Alongside Ferdinand, she unified Spain, established the Spanish Inquisition, and laid the groundwork for a global empire. Her decision to fund Columbus was a strategic one. Portugal had a monopoly on the sea route to the Indies around Africa. A westward route was a high-risk gamble, but if it paid off, it could break the Portuguese monopoly and open up immense new wealth for Spain. She was a savvy political operator, not just a pious benefactor. The myth of the jewels serves to soften her image, obscuring the hard-headed political and economic calculations that truly launched the Age of Discovery. Number 11 was Mary, Queen of Scots, a foolish queen ruled by her heart. Mary, Queen of Scots, became Queen of Scotland when she was just 6 days old in 1542. She spent her childhood being educated at the sophisticated and politically ruthless French court. She was briefly queen consort of France, giving her first-hand experience of how a major European power was run. Upon her return to Scotland, a country she barely knew, she successfully navigated its treacherous political landscape, dominated by feuding Protestant lords, for several years. Her downfall was the result of a series of political miscalculations and betrayals, not simply romantic folly. The popular story of Mary, Queen of Scots, is a romantic tragedy. She is portrayed as a beautiful, passionate, but ultimately foolish woman who let her heart rule her head. She made disastrous choices in men, the weak Lord Darnley, and the brutish Earl of Bothwell, which led to murder, scandal, and the loss of her throne. Her life is often contrasted with that of her cousin, the cool, calculating, and ultimately successful Elizabeth I of England. The narrative is that Mary was all heart and Elizabeth was all head, and in the brutal world of 16th century politics, the head won. This portrayal deeply underestimates Mary's political skills and the almost impossible situation she faced. To see her as simply a fool for love is to ignore the context of her life and reign. Mary was raised to be a queen. She was sent to France at the age of 5 and grew up in one of the most powerful and Machiavellian courts in Europe. She was well educated, intelligent, and fluent in multiple languages. She was, for a time, the Queen of France as well as Scotland, giving her a status that rivaled any monarch in Europe. When her French husband died, and she returned to Scotland in 1561 at the age of 18, she was not a naive girl. She was a seasoned political player stepping into a snake pit. Scotland was a notoriously difficult country to govern. It was relatively poor, dominated by powerful, feuding clans and nobles who had little loyalty to the crown. It was also in the throes of the Protestant Reformation. Mary was a Catholic queen in a newly and aggressively Protestant nation. The most powerful Protestant leader, John Knox, was a fiery preacher who had written a book titled The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regimen of Women, arguing that female rulers were against the law of God. This was the environment Mary had to navigate. For the first few years of her reign, she did so with remarkable success. She practiced a policy of religious tolerance, allowing the Protestant lords to worship as they pleased so long as she could practice her own Catholic faith in private. She asserted her authority over the nobles and governed effectively. Her problems began with her marriage. She needed to marry and produce an heir to secure her dynasty and strengthen her claim to the English throne. Her choice of her cousin, Lord Darnley, was a political one. He was a Catholic and also had a claim to the English throne, which strengthened Mary's own. But he was also arrogant, ambitious, and unstable. It was a political miscalculation, but one based on dynastic strategy, not love. Darnley's murder and Mary's subsequent marriage to the Earl of Bothwell, the chief suspect in the murder, was the final disaster. Whether Mary was involved in the plot to kill Darnley is one of history's great unsolved mysteries. It's possible she was a willing accomplice, but it's equally possible that she was coerced into the marriage by Bothwell, who effectively abducted her. Whatever the truth, the marriage was a political catastrophe. It united the Scottish lords against her, who saw it as an unforgivable scandal. They rebelled, imprisoned her, and forced her to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James. Her flight to England in 1568, seeking help from her cousin Elizabeth, was a final, desperate gamble that failed. Elizabeth, seeing Mary as a threat due to her strong Catholic claim to the English throne, kept her imprisoned for 19 years before finally executing her. Mary's downfall was caused by a series of political blunders in an incredibly hostile environment, compounded by betrayal and bad luck. To reduce her story to that of a woman who simply made bad romantic choices is to ignore the immense political, religious, and social forces that were stacked against her from the start. Number 10 was Wu Zetian, a cruel tyrant who murdered her own children. The most damning stories about Wu Zetian, including the accusation that she smothered her own infant daughter to frame a rival, were written by Confucian scholars after her death. These male historians had a vested interest in portraying China's only female emperor as unnatural and monstrous. Wu Zetian's reign, however, saw a significant expansion of the Chinese empire, a reform of the civil service to promote talent over aristocratic birth, and a flourishing of Buddhism and scholarship. Many of the policies she put in place were continued by her successors and contributed to one of the golden ages of Chinese history. Wu Zetian holds a unique and controversial place in China's long history. She was the only woman to ever rule as emperor in her own right, adopting the title of Huangdi and founding her own dynasty, the Zhou. The traditional historical accounts written by her successors paint her as a ruthless, power-hungry usurper who used murder, manipulation, and a secret police force to seize and hold the throne. The most horrific story told about her is that she killed her own newborn daughter and blamed the death on the childless Empress Wang, clearing her own path to becoming the emperor's new consort. This image of a monstrous tyrant has been the dominant narrative for centuries. However, modern historians have begun to question this version of events, seeing it as a predictable backlash against a woman who shattered every Confucian norm about the role of women in society. Confucianism, the dominant political and social philosophy of the time, was deeply patriarchal. It held that society was based on a strict hierarchy, with men ruling over women. A woman ruling as emperor was not just a political anomaly, it was an offense against the natural order of the universe. The historians who wrote the official records of the Tang dynasty after Wu's death were all male Confucian scholars. They had every reason to portray her reign as a disaster, a cautionary tale against female power. When we look at the actual achievements of her reign, a different picture emerges. Wu Zetian was a highly effective and capable ruler for several decades, first as the power behind the throne for her ailing husband and weak sons, and then as emperor herself from 690 to 705. She was a shrewd judge of character and promoted talented men to high office based on merit, not just their noble family connections. She expanded the imperial examination system, making it more accessible to men from lower-ranking families. This had the double effect of bringing new talent into the government and weakening the power of the old aristocratic clans who were her main rivals. In foreign policy, she oversaw a series of military campaigns that expanded Chinese influence in Central Asia and on the Korean Peninsula. Her reign was a period of relative peace and stability within China itself. She was also a great patron of Buddhism, which she elevated to a status above Taoism, the traditional faith of the Tang imperial family. This was a clever political move, as Buddhist scripture contained passages that could be interpreted to sanction female rulers, providing her with a source of legitimacy outside the hostile Confucian system. This is not to say she was a gentle ruler. The 7th century was a brutal time, and court politics were a matter of life and death. Wu Zetian undoubtedly used ruthless methods to deal with her political opponents. She established a secret police to root out conspiracies against her, and many members of the old aristocracy and the Tang imperial family were demoted, exiled, or executed. But her actions were not necessarily more brutal than those of many male emperors who founded new dynasties. The difference is that their ruthlessness was often praised as decisiveness, while hers was condemned as unnatural cruelty. The story of her murdering her own child, for which there is no conclusive evidence, is the ultimate slander, a way to portray her as so monstrously ambitious that she violated even the most sacred bond of a mother and child. It was a powerful piece of character assassination designed to ensure that no woman would ever follow in her footsteps. Number 9 was Catherine the Great, a German usurper who hated Russia. When she first arrived in Russia at the age of 14, the German princess Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst immediately began learning the Russian language and studying the Russian Orthodox faith. She would often get up in the middle of the night to practice her Russian, sometimes catching pneumonia from the cold. She converted to Orthodoxy with deep sincerity and took the name Ekaterina, or Catherine. Throughout her reign, she presented herself as a true patriot and champion of Russian culture and expansion, earning the devotion of the military and the nobility. Catherine the Great is one of the most famous rulers in Russian history, known for presiding over a golden age of expansion and enlightenment. But there's a persistent narrative that casts her as an outsider, a cold and calculating German princess who seized the Russian throne from her true Russian husband, Peter III, and never truly belonged. This story suggests she was fundamentally a foreigner who used Russia for her own ambitions, rather than a leader who genuinely identified with her adopted country. This myth is rooted in her origins. She was born Sophie Friederike Auguste von Anhalt-Zerbst in Prussia. She came to Russia in 1744 as a teenage bride for the heir to the throne, the Grand Duke Peter. She was German, a Lutheran, and spoke no Russian. Her husband Peter was also of German descent, but he was the grandson of Peter the Great and the designated heir. On the surface, he had the stronger claim. The coup that brought Catherine to power in 1762, which resulted in Peter's removal and subsequent death, can easily be painted as a foreign usurpation. However, this narrative gets the characters completely backward. It was Catherine who embraced Russia and Peter who rejected it. From the moment she arrived, the young Sophie threw herself into becoming Russian. She diligently studied the language until she was fluent, and she eagerly converted to Russian Orthodoxy, the state religion. She read widely in Russian history and culture, and made a conscious effort to win the favor of powerful figures at court and in the military. She understood that to survive and to rule, she had to be more Russian than the Russians. Her husband, Peter, was the opposite. Despite his Russian heritage, he remained culturally German his entire life. He openly admired Frederick the Great of Prussia, Russia's great enemy at the time. He spoke Russian poorly, scorned the Orthodox Church, and tried to force the Russian army to adopt Prussian-style uniforms and drills, which they despised. When he became emperor in 1762, one of his first acts was to pull Russia out of the Seven Years' War and give back all the territory Russia had won from Prussia, a move that was seen as a national betrayal by the military. He was unpopular, erratic, and seen by the Russian elite as an embarrassing and dangerous foreigner. Catherine, in contrast, had spent 18 years carefully building a network of support. She was intelligent, charming, and devoutly orthodox. She was seen as the defender of Russian interests against her pro-Prussian husband. The coup of 1762 was not so much a foreign usurpation as it was a palace revolution led by the Russian Imperial Guard, who chose the German princess they saw as a true Russian patriot over the Russian heir they saw as a German stooge. Throughout her 34-year reign, Catherine worked tirelessly to position herself as the heir to the legacy of Peter the Great. She expanded the Russian Empire dramatically, securing the northern coast of the Black Sea from the Ottoman Empire and partitioning Poland. She was a great patron of the arts and sciences, corresponding with Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot. She founded schools and academies and oversaw legal reforms. While she could be ruthless, her entire public identity was that of a Russian empress dedicated to the glory of her nation. The myth of the German usurper ignores the crucial fact that she earned her throne by being, in every way that mattered to the Russian power structure, more Russian than her husband. And number 8 was Tsarina Alexandra, a German spy working to destroy Russia. Tsarina Alexandra was born Princess Alex of Hesse and by Rhine, a German principality. However, her mother was the daughter of Queen Victoria, and she spent much of her childhood in England. She was deeply devoted to her husband, Tsar Nicholas II, and to Russia, her adopted country. The accusations that she was a German spy during World War I were baseless rumors fueled by anti-German hysteria and public anger over Russia's military failures. She was a tragic, misguided figure, not a traitor. During the immense stress and suffering of World War I, Russia was desperate for a scapegoat. The war was going disastrously, the army was poorly equipped, millions of soldiers were dying, and there was widespread hunger and unrest on the home front. In this atmosphere of fear and paranoia, a simple and sinister explanation took hold. The German-born Tsarina Alexandra Fyodorovna was secretly working for the enemy. She was a spy in the palace, deliberately sabotaging the Russian war effort to help her native Germany win. This was one of the most potent and destructive myths of the late Romanov era. It was repeated in whispers and breadlines, in gossip, in high society, and in angry speeches by politicians in the Duma. The story seemed plausible to many. Alexandra had been a German princess. She spoke Russian with a noticeable accent. She was shy and withdrawn, which was misinterpreted as coldness and arrogance, and she had an unhealthy influence over her husband, the weak-willed Tsar Nicholas II, especially through her reliance on the mystic Grigory Rasputin. The narrative was perfect. The holy fool Rasputin and the German spy were controlling the Tsar and deliberately driving Russia to ruin. The truth is that there is not a shred of evidence that Alexandra was a traitor. In fact, she was a fervent Russian patriot. She had converted to the Russian Orthodox faith with a passion that impressed even her critics. She embraced her role as Tsarina and was deeply committed to the principle of Russian autocracy. During the war, she and her older daughters trained as Red Cross nurses. They worked tirelessly in military hospitals, tending to wounded soldiers, often performing grueling and unpleasant tasks. She organized and funded hospital trains to bring supplies to the front. Her letters from the period are filled with prayers for a Russian victory and anguish over the country's suffering. So why did the spy myth become so widespread? First, there was the simple fact of her German birth. In the nationalistic frenzy of the war, anyone with German connections was suspect. Second, her relationship with Rasputin was a political disaster. The uneducated Siberian peasant seemed to be the only one who could ease the suffering of her hemophiliac son, Alexei. Her reliance on him was absolute. When Nicholas then went to the front to command the army in 1915, he left Alexandra in charge at home. She, in turn, relied on Rasputin's advice for political appointments. Competent ministers were dismissed and replaced by a succession of corrupt or incompetent cronies recommended by Rasputin. This created chaos in the government and gave the impression that the entire state was being run by a mad monk and his German puppet mistress. The rumors were actively spread by those who wanted to undermine the monarchy, politicians who wanted a more constitutional government, and revolutionaries who wanted to overthrow the Tsar entirely, found the story of the treacherous Serena to be an incredibly effective weapon. It destroyed what little public trust remained in the imperial family. The myth transformed Alexandra from a politically inept and tragic figure into a malevolent enemy of the people. It was a lie that helped to poison the public mind against the Romanovs and paved the way for the revolution that would ultimately consume her and her entire family. Number 7 was Hatshepsut, a woman who tried to be a man. Hatshepsut's reign, which lasted for over 20 years in the 15th century BC, was one of Egypt's most prosperous periods. She oversaw a major building program, including her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, and launched a famous trading expedition to the land of Punt. The depiction of her as a male pharaoh with a kilt and a false beard was not an attempt to deny her gender. It was a way to use the traditional established iconography of kingship to legitimize her rule in a society where a female pharaoh was highly unusual. In many inscriptions, she is still referred to using feminine pronouns, showing that her gender was not a secret. Hatshepsut was one of the most powerful and successful pharaohs of the New Kingdom. She ruled for 2 decades and brought peace and immense wealth to Egypt. Yet, for centuries, she was largely forgotten, her name erased from history. When she was rediscovered by archaeologists in the 19th century, her story was often misinterpreted. The most common interpretation focused on her depiction in statues and carvings as a male king, complete with a man's kilt and the ceremonial false beard of a pharaoh. This led to the popular myth that she was a woman who wanted to be a man, a cross-dresser, who denied her own femininity to seize power. This view completely misunderstands the nature of Egyptian art and the concept of pharaonic power. For the ancient Egyptians, the role of the pharaoh was a sacred cosmic office, not just a job. The king was the earthly embodiment of the god Horus, the link between humanity and the divine. For 3,000 years, this office had been defined in male terms. All the iconography, all the titles, all the religious and political language associated with kingship were masculine. There was simply no established template for a female pharaoh. When Hatshepsut came to power, she faced a unique challenge. Yeah, she was initially the regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III, but within a few years, she had herself crowned as pharaoh, taking on the full titles and authority of a king. To legitimize this unprecedented move, she had to present herself to her people and to the gods within the existing framework of kingship. She couldn't invent a whole new female version of the pharaoh's image overnight, so she used the tools that were available. She adopted the male titles, the male costume, and the male pose in her official portraits. This was not a personal choice about gender identity, it was a political and religious necessity. The false beard, for example, was not a real beard. It was a divine attribute, a symbol of pharaonic power worn by male kings for centuries. By wearing it, Hatshepsut was not saying, "I am a man." She was saying, "I am the pharaoh." It was a way of signaling that she held the same sacred office and possessed the same divine authority as all the male kings who had come before her. Crucially, she did not completely erase her female identity. In many of the inscriptions in her temple, the text refers to her with feminine pronouns and titles like daughter of Re, even when the accompanying image shows her as a male king. The Egyptians were not confused about her being a woman. They knew who she was. The use of male iconography was a clever solution to a problem of political representation. It allowed her to fulfill the traditional duties of the king while still acknowledging her female reality in the written word. After her death, her stepson, Thutmose III, eventually became pharaoh. Late in his reign, he ordered that Hatshepsut's name and image be erased from many monuments. This was once interpreted as an act of personal revenge. However, it's now believed to be a more political move, an attempt to smooth over the disruption she had caused to the male line of succession and restore a more traditional patriarchal order for future generations. The myth of Hatshepsut as a woman trying to be a man is a modern misunderstanding. The reality is that she was a brilliant political innovator who found a way to rule as a woman within a rigidly masculine system. Number 6 was Josephine Bonaparte, a shallow spender who cheated on Napoleon. Before she met Napoleon, Josephine, then known as Rose de Beauharnais, survived the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution. Her first husband was executed, and she herself was imprisoned and scheduled for the guillotine, only to be saved by the fall of Robespierre. She was a shrewd survivor who used her social connections and charm to navigate the dangerous political world of post-revolutionary France. As Empress, she was a skilled diplomat and a renowned patron of the arts and sciences, particularly botany. She created one of the greatest collections of roses in the world at her estate, Malmaison. The popular image of Josephine Bonaparte is often that of a frivolous and unfaithful Creole socialite. She is remembered for her extravagant spending on clothes and jewelry, her numerous love affairs, and her inability to provide Napoleon with an heir, which led to their divorce. In the epic story of Napoleon, she is often cast in a supporting role as the great love who broke his heart and the beautiful but shallow trophy wife. This portrayal captures a small part of her personality, but completely ignores her intelligence, resilience, and political importance. Josephine was above all else a survivor. Born Marie Josephine Rose Tacher de la Pagerie on the island of Martinique, she came to France for an arranged marriage to a young aristocrat, Alexandre de Beauharnais. The marriage was unhappy, but it gave her 2 children and an entry into high society. During the French Revolution, their aristocratic status put them in grave danger. Alexandre was executed and Rose was imprisoned. She only escaped the same fate by a matter of days. She emerged from prison a widow with 2 children and no money, in a world where the old rules had been swept away. She survived by using her wits, her charm, and her social connections. She became a prominent figure in the new freewheeling society of the Directory, where she had several powerful protectors. When she met the young, brilliant, but socially awkward General Napoleon Bonaparte, she was a 32-year-old woman of the world, and he was a 26-year-old rising star. He fell madly in love with her. For her, it was likely a more pragmatic match, initially a way to secure her future and her children's. It's true that she had an affair early in their marriage while Napoleon was away on campaign in Egypt. It's also true that she spent lavishly, but to focus only on these things is to miss her true value to Napoleon's regime. As he rose from general to first consul to emperor, Josephine's social grace was a huge asset. She knew how to manage the new imperial court, blending the remnants of the old aristocracy with the new, self-made men of Napoleon's circle. She was a master of soft power, smoothing over political rivalries and winning over potential enemies with her charm and diplomacy. She acted as a valuable sounding board for Napoleon, who trusted her political instincts. She was also a major cultural figure. At her estate, Malmaison, she created one of the most magnificent gardens in Europe. She was a passionate botanist, collecting rare and exotic plants from all over the world. She sponsored scientific expeditions and patronized artists and craftsmen, helping to define the empire style that characterized the era. She was far from a shallow clothes horse. She was an active and influential patron of the arts and sciences. Her greatest political failure was her inability to have a child with Napoleon. The lack of an heir was a serious threat to the stability of the new dynasty he was trying to create. Their divorce in 1810 was a political necessity, and it was a source of genuine sadness for both of them. They remained on affectionate terms for the rest of their lives. The caricature of Josephine as the unfaithful, spendthrift first wife obscures the reality of a resourceful, intelligent, and politically savvy woman who was an essential partner in Napoleon's rise to power and a significant cultural force in her own right. Number 5 was Boudica, a wild barbarian queen with flaming red hair. The most detailed physical description of Boudica comes from the Roman historian Cassius Dio, who was writing over a century after she died. He describes her as tall, with long red hair, a harsh voice, and a fierce expression. This description was likely based on Roman stereotypes of Celtic and Germanic barbarians, rather than any eyewitness account. Roman propaganda often portrayed their enemies as wild and uncivilized to make Roman victories seem more impressive and their rule seem more necessary. There is no archaeological evidence or British source to confirm her appearance. The image of Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe, is one of the most powerful in British history. We picture her as a wild warrior queen, standing in a chariot with scythed wheels, her long red hair streaming behind her as she leads her people in a furious, but ultimately doomed rebellion against the might of Rome. She is a symbol of Celtic defiance, a barbarian fury unleashed. This dramatic image, however, is largely a creation of Roman propaganda and later Victorian Romanticism. The real Boudica was likely a far more strategic and politically motivated leader than the wild-haired avenger of legend. Our only sources for Boudica's rebellion in 60 to 61 AD are two Roman historians, Tacitus and Cassius Dio. There are no surviving British accounts. Both Romans wrote with a specific agenda to tell a story about Roman power and the dangers of misgovernment. They both described the legitimate grievances that led to the revolt. After the death of Boudica's husband, Prasutagus, who had been a client king of Rome, the Romans ignored his will, seized the tribe's lands, and publicly flogged Boudica while her daughters were assaulted. These were calculated acts of humiliation and oppression designed to crush the Iceni. The rebellion was not a random outburst of savagery, it was a response to extreme Roman provocation. The popular image of Boudica owes a great deal to Cassius Dio's very vivid, and probably very fictional, physical description. Long, wild, red hair was a common Roman stereotype for people from northern Europe. It was a shorthand way of saying barbarian. The scythed chariots are also likely a Roman invention, a dramatic detail added to make the Britons seem more exotic and terrifying. While the Britons did use chariots in warfare, there is no real evidence they attached blades to the wheels. The Victorian era fell in love with the story of Boudica. They saw her as a proto-Britannic hero, a fierce mother defending her nation, much like their own Queen Victoria, who they imagined as the head of a new Roman Empire. The famous statue of her near the Houses of Parliament in London, complete with the scythed chariot, was created during this period and cemented this romantic warrior queen image in the public consciousness. But the reality of the rebellion shows evidence of strategic thinking, not just blind rage. Boudica united several different British tribes, a significant diplomatic achievement. Her army targeted three key Roman settlements: Camulodunum, Colchester, the center of Roman imperial cult Londinium, London, a thriving commercial hub, and Verulamium, St. Albans, a town of Romanized Britons. These were not random targets. They were symbols of Roman political, economic, and cultural power. The destruction of these cities was a calculated blow against the infrastructure of the Roman occupation. Ultimately, her tribal army, though large, was no match for the discipline and superior tactics of the Roman legions in a pitched battle. The rebellion was brutally crushed. The Romans portrayed her as a symbol of barbarian fury, a force of nature that had to be tamed. The Victorians remade her into a national hero. The historical Boudica was likely somewhere in between a capable tribal leader pushed into rebellion by Roman brutality, who led a well-planned but ultimately unsuccessful war of liberation. She was a political and military figure, not just a mythical avenger with flowing red hair. Number 4 was Queen Christina of Sweden, a frivolous ruler who abandoned her kingdom. When Queen Christina was one of the most educated women of the 17th century. She spoke 8 languages, studied philosophy, mathematics, and religion for 10 hours a day, and corresponded with leading intellectuals all over Europe, including the philosopher René Descartes, whom she invited to her court in Stockholm. Her decision to abdicate was not a sudden whim. It was the result of a years-long secret conversion to Catholicism, a faith that was illegal for a Swedish monarch to practice, and a deep-seated desire to pursue a life of intellectual and artistic freedom in Rome. The story of Queen Christina of Sweden is often simplified into a tale of a flighty, eccentric young queen who grew bored with the tedious business of ruling and scandalously abandoned her throne and her country to live a life of freedom in the sunny south. She is remembered for her masculine style of dress, her refusal to marry, and her shocking abdication in 1654 at the age of 28. This narrative paints her as irresponsible and selfish, a ruler who shirked her sacred duty for personal indulgence. This caricature completely misses the profound intellectual and spiritual crisis that led to her decision. Christina was anything but frivolous. She was a brilliant and intensely serious intellectual, Raised as a king rather than a princess by her father, the great warrior king Gustavus Adolphus, she received a rigorous classical education. From the moment she came of age and took power, she worked to make Stockholm a cultural capital, the Athens of the North. She spent a fortune on books, art, and manuscripts, and invited scholars and artists from across Europe to her court. But she found herself increasingly at odds with the world she was born to rule. She was the monarch of a staunchly Lutheran country, a major power in Protestant Europe. Yet, through her extensive studies of philosophy and theology, she found herself secretly drawn to Catholicism. She began a secret correspondence with Jesuits and came to believe that Catholicism was the one true faith. As the head of the Lutheran Swedish Church, this created an impossible conflict. To openly declare herself Catholic while on the throne would have caused a massive political and religious crisis and would have been illegal. Beyond the religious conflict, Christina also felt constrained by the very nature of monarchy. She despised the endless ceremonies, the political maneuvering, and the expectation that she would marry and produce an heir to continue the dynasty. She wrote that she would rather die than be married. Her true passion was for art, music, philosophy, and science. She longed for a life where she could pursue these interests freely, without the constraints of being a queen. Her abdication was not an act of impulse, it was a carefully planned escape. It was the only way she could be true to both her newfound faith and her intellectual passions. After abdicating, she made her way to Rome, where her conversion to Catholicism was a huge propaganda victory for the Pope. She became a central figure in Roman cultural life, establishing a major academy, patronizing musicians like Corelli and Scarlatti, and amassing a world-class art collection. She was not just a retired queen living a quiet life, she was an active and influential cultural power broker. She continued to be a radical and unconventional figure, defending intellectual freedom and challenging both religious and social norms for the rest of her life. The story of the frivolous queen who ran away from her duties is a shallow interpretation of a very deep and complex reality. She was a woman of formidable intellect who made a radical choice to sacrifice a kingdom for the sake of her conscience and her mind. Number 3 was Queen Ranavalona I of Madagascar, a mad and bloody tyrant. During Ranavalona I's 33-year reign, from 1828 to 1861, she successfully prevented France and Britain from colonizing Madagascar. She promoted industrial self-sufficiency, creating local manufacturing of guns, cannons, and other modern goods to reduce reliance on foreign imports. The stories of her extreme cruelty come almost exclusively from European sources, particularly missionaries, traders, and diplomats whose colonial ambitions she thwarted. While her rule was harsh and involved public executions, her methods were aimed at maintaining Malagasy independence and cultural identity in the face of intense European pressure. In the annals of 19th century European history, Queen Ranavalona I of Madagascar is often referred to as the Mad Queen of Madagascar, a female Caligula, or simply a bloodthirsty tyrant. The accounts written by Europeans who visited her island kingdom are filled with lurid tales of mass executions, bizarre trials by ordeal, and a fanatical hatred of foreigners and Christians. She is portrayed as a monster, an irrational savage whose reign was a dark age of terror for her people. This image of Ranavalona has been remarkably persistent. However, this entire narrative needs to be seen for what it is: colonialist propaganda. It was written by the very people European missionaries, traders, and government agents whose attempts to control Madagascar she successfully resisted for over 3 decades. They had every reason to portray her as a monster. It justified their own imperial ambitions and painted their failure to colonize the island as a narrow escape from a savage queen rather than a defeat at the hands of a shrewd and determined political leader. When Ranavalona came to the throne in 1828, she inherited a kingdom that her predecessor, Radama I, had begun to modernize with European help. Radama had welcomed British advisors and missionaries and had signed treaties that gave Britain significant influence. Ranavalona saw this growing European presence as a grave threat to Malagasy sovereignty. She believed that her husband had been naive and that the Europeans' ultimate goal was not to help, but to conquer. She was, as history would show, across Africa, correct? Her reign was dedicated to a single overriding policy, Madagascar for the Malagasy. She systematically reversed Radama's pro-European policies. She expelled foreign missionaries who she saw as agents of a cultural invasion that undermined traditional beliefs and loyalty to the crown. She tore up the treaties with Britain that limited her economic freedom. She launched a program of industrialization to make Madagascar self-sufficient, using a mix of local and coerced foreign expertise to build factories that produced everything from soap to firearms. This was a direct challenge to the European traders who wanted to control the island's economy. To enforce her policies and maintain national unity, she used methods that were undeniably harsh. She relied on the Tangena ordeal, a traditional practice where guilt or innocence was determined by swallowing a poison. Thousands died from this practice. She also used forced labor for her public works projects and ruthlessly suppressed political dissent. The persecution of Malagasy Christians, who were seen as loyal to a foreign power rather than to her, was particularly severe. But to label her as simply mad or bloodthirsty is to view her through a purely European lens and ignore her political goals. She was not irrational. Her policies were calculated to preserve her kingdom's independence. She saw the European powers carving up Africa and was determined that Madagascar would not be next. In this, she was remarkably successful. During her entire 33-year reign, she repelled several European military incursions and kept Madagascar free from colonial rule. It was only after her death that her successors reopened the island to European influence, leading to the French conquest in the 1890s. The European accounts focus on her cruelty, but conveniently omit the context that she was a ruler engaged in a desperate and, for a time, successful anti-colonial struggle. She was a ruthless nationalist leader, not a madwoman. Number 2 was Lucrezia Borgia, a vicious poisoner. There is not a single reliable contemporary source that accuses Lucrezia Borgia of poisoning anyone. The rumors about her being a master of poison and incest were spread by the political enemies of her family, especially the rivals of her father, Pope Alexander VI, and her brother, Cesare Borgia. After she left Rome and became the Duchess of Ferrara, she was known as a respected and pious ruler, a patron of the arts, and a successful administrator for the rest of her life. She was praised by her subjects for her charity and competence. The name Lucrezia Borgia is synonymous with Renaissance villainy. She is the ultimate femme fatale, a beautiful but deadly woman at the heart of a corrupt and power-hungry family. The legend tells of her as a master poisoner who, at the behest of her father, Pope Alexander VI, and her brother, the ruthless Cesare Borgia, would dispose of their enemies at lavish banquets. She is often imagined with a hollowed-out ring full of poison, a cantarella concocted by her family. This image, combined with rumors of incestuous relationships with her father and brother, has made her a lurid and fascinating figure for centuries. This entire sinister reputation is a myth. It is a classic example of how political slander can completely destroy a person's historical legacy. Lucrezia Borgia was not a villain, she was a pawn. Her life was entirely controlled by the men in her family, who used her as a tool to advance their own political ambitions. The Borgias were a Spanish family who rose to power in Italy and were widely hated by the established Italian noble families. As Pope, Alexander VI was a secular prince as much as a spiritual leader, and he used every means at his disposal, including warfare, diplomacy, and his children's marriages, to expand his family's power. Lucrezia's role in this grand plan was to be married off to secure alliances. She was married 3 times, with each marriage dictated by the shifting political needs of her father and brother. Her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza was annulled when the Borgias no longer needed an alliance with the Sforza family. Her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, was murdered, almost certainly on the orders of her brother Cesare, because he had become a political liability. The rumors and black legends about Lucrezia started during this period in Rome. The Borgias' enemies, and there were many, spread stories of incredible depravity at the papal court to discredit them. Lucrezia, as the most visible woman in the family, was an easy target. The tales of poisonings and orgies were political weapons designed to paint the Borgias as monsters who were unfit to rule. The turning point in Lucrezia's life came with her third marriage to Alfonso d'Este, the heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. This was another political match, but it finally removed her from the toxic environment of Rome and the direct control of her family. In Ferrara, she was able to create her own life and her own reputation, and it was a reputation for being a model Renaissance duchess. She established a court that was a center of art and culture, patronizing poets like Ariosto and painters like Titian. She proved to be a capable and respected administrator, ruling as regent for her husband when he was away at war. She was known for her piety and her extensive charity work, founding hospitals and convents. The people of Ferrara apparently admired her. There is no evidence from her time in Ferrara, or even from her time in Rome, that she was involved in any murder or poisoning. The lurid stories all come from biased sources, from the diaries and letters of the Borgia's political enemies. The real Lucrezia was not a scheming poisoner. She was an intelligent and resilient woman born into a ruthless family who used her as a political playing piece. She endured immense trauma and public slander, but when finally given the chance, she proved herself to be a capable, cultured, and compassionate ruler. The evil seductress of legend is a fiction created by political hatred. Number one, did Mary Magdalene have a romantic relationship with Jesus? The idea that Mary Magdalene was the wife or romantic partner of Jesus is a modern concept that has no basis in the historical texts of the New Testament or in early Christian tradition. This theory was most famously popularized by the 2003 novel The Da Vinci Code. In the four canonical Gospels, Mary Magdalene is depicted as a prominent follower of Jesus, one of the few who was present at his crucifixion and the first person to witness his resurrection. For centuries, the dominant and also incorrect myth about her was that she was a repentant prostitute, a story that originated from a 6th century sermon by Pope Gregory the Great, who conflated her with other unnamed women in the Gospels. There are few figures in history as misunderstood and misrepresented as Mary Magdalene. For centuries, she was wrongly labeled as a prostitute, a symbol of female sin and repentance. In recent decades, that image has been replaced by an even more popular and sensational one, Mary Magdalene as the wife of Jesus Christ, the mother of his child, and the keeper of a secret bloodline. This idea, fueled by speculative books and blockbuster novels, has captured the public imagination. It reframes the story of early Christianity as a grand conspiracy to suppress the sacred feminine and hide the truth about Jesus' humanity. This entire narrative, however compelling, is a modern invention. There is absolutely no historical evidence in any of the earliest Christian writings, the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or the letters of Paul C., to suggest that Jesus was married or had a romantic relationship with Mary Magdalene. In these texts, she is consistently portrayed as one of his most important and loyal disciples. She is named as one of the women who traveled with Jesus and the 12 apostles and helped support their ministry financially. Crucially, she is present at the crucifixion when most of the male disciples had fled in fear. And most importantly, in all four Gospels, she is the first witness to the resurrection, the foundational event of the Christian faith. She is the one chosen to bring the news to the other disciples, a role that earns her the ancient title Apostle to the Apostles. So where did the wife of Jesus theory come from? It's largely a product of modern fiction and fringe historical theories. The idea was popularized in the 1982 book Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which proposed a conspiracy involving the Knights Templar and a secret bloodline, and it became a global phenomenon with Dan Brown's 2003 novel, The Da Vinci Code. These works often point to later, non-canonical texts known as the Gnostic Gospels as proof. For example, the Gospel of Philip mentions that Jesus used to kiss Mary often, and that she was his companion. However, these texts were written a century or more after the canonical Gospels and reflect the unique theology of a specific Gnostic sect, not mainstream early Christian belief. The kiss was likely a symbolic ritual of fellowship, not a romantic one, and the word companion had a spiritual, not a marital, meaning. The older myth, that of Mary Magdalene the prostitute, is also a fabrication, but a much more ancient one. This idea originated in a sermon given by Pope Gregory the Great in the year 591. he conflated Mary Magdalene with two other unnamed women mentioned in the Gospels, the anonymous sinful woman who anoints Jesus' feet with oil, and Mary of Bethany. There is no textual reason to believe these three women are the same person, but Pope Gregory's interpretation was incredibly influential, and for the next 1400 years, Mary Magdalene was officially portrayed in the Western Church as a repentant sinner. This image was only officially corrected by the Catholic Church in 1969. Both of these myths, the prostitute and the wife, do a great disservice to the historical Mary Magdalene. They both define her entirely by a supposed sexual relationship with a man. They obscure her true and historically verifiable role, that of a brave and influential female leader in the early Jesus movement, a key disciple trusted with the most important proclamation of her faith. She was not a sinner or a secret wife. She was a foundational figure of early Christianity in her own right.